quienes se van a encargar, como les comentaba antes, de hacer la relación entre las experiencias presentadas y las prioridades del marco de Jehová. Así que invito a todos a que tomen asiento para que continuemos con el evento. Siguiendo con el orden en el que hemos venido trabajando, la primera prioridad con la que trabajamos es velar porque la reducción de los riesgos de desastres constituya una prioridad nacional y local dotada de una sólida base institucional de aplicación. Les recuerdo que para esta prioridad tuvimos dos presentaciones: el convenio de cooperación y asistencia entre el INAMU y COPECO, construcción de capacidades nacionales, fue la presentación de Honduras, que estuvo a cargo de Yolanda Pérez y Oscar Reyes, y el estudio que mostraba la situación de las mujeres internamente desplazadas en Haití 3 meses después del terremoto, que estuvo a cargo de Clemencia Ramírez de la OIM, quien presentó el estudio de situación que se hizo por parte de la organización. Así que los dejo con la primera prioridad.
Muy buenas tardes. ¿Está encendido? Sí. Bueno, me toca a mí comentar muy brevemente la relación o lo importante de estas presentaciones o de estas experiencias que hemos visto para la primera prioridad en función de su adecuación con esta prioridad, su aporte al cumplimiento de esta prioridad número 1, ¿no? Como creo que un elemento importante a destacar de la prioridad es que plantea la importancia de una base sólida o una sólida base institucional para la implementación de esta reducción de riesgo de desastres. Entiendo que en ese sentido esta experiencia que nos presentó Honduras de una alianza, un convenio entre la institución, el Instituto Nacional de la Mujer y el COPECO, es un ejemplo interesante para la región y que puede ser una buena lección aprendida, pienso. Primero surge de un ambiente como este, ¿no? De una conferencia donde ahí vemos la importancia de estos escenarios para conocernos y crear sinergias. Eso es bien interesante. Y el hecho de que este convenio pudiera ser una otra alianza con otra institución para la formación del personal de seguridad. Entonces, bueno, el convenio logra 3 productos, o digamos 2 productos importantes. Uno es la inclusión del tema de ambiental en el plan estratégico para incorporación de género y entonces de equidad de género, y además logra el posgrado en seguridad pública. Entonces, esto permite aprovechar las fortalezas de ambas instituciones, por ejemplo, con todo el desarrollo del despliegue territorial que tiene el Instituto Nacional de la Mujer, cómo el COPECO puede hacer uso, ¿no?, de este mismo institucionalidad para conseguir apoyo, y entonces a la vez eso hace que el COPECO pueda ir incorporando esta perspectiva de género. Creo que es un buen ejemplo de cómo las alianzas y la creación de estrategias de red, de convenios, de plataformas pueden ser exitosas y pueden ayudarnos a cumplimiento de estas prioridades. La otra experiencia, la que presentó la OIM sobre el estudio en Haití, me parece también muy interesante y que es una buena experiencia también en otro aspecto de la prioridad 1, que es el tema de garantizar la participación comunitaria con el fin de que se satisfagan las necesidades locales. Esta experiencia de investigación permite, como muy bien dijo Clemencia, escuchar las voces de las mujeres. El trabajo de la OIM se hace en colaboración con una organización de mujeres de Haití, una organización de base, que es la que apoya el esfuerzo y permite entonces ese acercamiento con las mujeres en una situación post-desastre terrible, pero que permite entonces captar dónde están esas necesidades de las mujeres y cómo entonces al levantar esa información puede nutrir la política pública de reducción de riesgo de desastres con una perspectiva de género pero efectiva, porque puede entonces tener elementos claves, variables importantes que ellas analizan que son muy específicas de género, como el tema de la violencia, como el tema de la salud sexual y reproductiva y como el tema de la salud mental, que no siempre son tomadas en cuenta. Esto, desde las voces de las mujeres, entonces puede ser un avance importante en la creación de una política pública que realmente integre una efectiva perspectiva de género para la reducción del riesgo de desastres.
Buenas tardes. I'm so pleased. I guess I can take mine off. I'm really pleased to see so many of you here. For one, most conferences I think you would be gone by now, so thank you. Last time I met you yesterday, I said I have no examples from the region, but I know I will have them when I leave, and it's been a fabulous day. Fabulous day. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you have shared and brought to the table today. It's really important. I wish that we had more governments and more ministries. People here, a little fly on the wall would have heard so much. So I wanted to just comment a little bit on the third priority area for action in the HFA, and just begin with a general comment about the HFA, which understands that all of these 5 different sectors are extremely interwoven, right? And sees gender as cross-cutting, but also sees cultural sensitivity as cross-cutting, community-based work, participatory work, GIS work, so there are a lot of cross-cutting themes. So we're addressing one piece of that. I, of course, am particularly interested in the awareness, education, and training piece as a researcher and a scholar myself. So I just wanted to direct our attention to what the third priority of action is. So I'll just read for a moment. It's directed at governments. Governments are urged to make better use of existing information, conduct trainings for key stakeholders, mainstream risk reduction in schools, promote comprehensive awareness program. The multifaceted roles of women as work, family, and community educators cannot be overemphasized and must be capitalized upon. I think we have given ample evidence of that today, and I do hope that in the long run we'll be able to consolidate these experiences that you've had along with the questions and the answers, right? To share them in a more systematic way over time, and perhaps the new Gender and Disaster Network of the Latin American Caribbean region, GDN-LAC, might be an avenue for that. We might want to talk about that tomorrow. So briefly, number 3 I think is very important. They all bear on the same issue, which is to bring a gender perspective into risk reduction. So all of our work around awareness, education, information, training needs to address the fundamental fact that gender inequalities are a driving force that produces risk, that puts communities at risk. So anything that we can do to break down that, those social relationships through our education, awareness, and training and curriculum development work is important. They all bear on that theme. So everybody would have heard something different today. I'll just briefly talk about some of the things that I saw listening for this theme of awareness, education, training as it emerged through all of the presentations, with apologies because it's all a big jumble. There were so many, and I wanted to pull out the general ideas rather than the specifics. But to begin, I think we have seen here today, again, in this region, that women have an enormous amount of local specific, context specific, gender specific, and also broad community knowledge that can and must be and has been, is being exploited, is being capitalized upon. So in that sense, what you're doing is exactly right. That we have heard examples of what happens when you ask women to speak, when you give women a space, or when women take that space. And then we've heard also what happens when that knowledge is not acted upon, when you do gender-based research and nobody takes it on board, right? When you do have it as a platform for future action, and then once again, when the next pledge, you're back at square one again. We also heard examples of building up and scaling and sharing knowledge from previous gender-based research in the past. That's a platform for future work, and I think that's an important finding as well from your conversations today. We certainly hear and heard lots of models of how women have, again, knowledge to share and offer, but also need knowledge, really need training, want that training. And I would just echo that from my work around the world. I think it's a constant theme. But it needs to be, as you know, and as your examples demonstrate, specific to what women need. So scaling up rural agricultural livelihoods in a way that advances them rather than reproduces those same social conditions. Training that addresses sexual health and reproductive issues. Training that addresses the disparities in the household around violence. Or training that develops women's leadership capacities. Training that helps women understand the experiences of the institutional networks that are surrounding them around disaster risk management. Lots of those issues came through as well. This one I can't read, but no, the importance of women's organizations, ministries, from the top to the bottom, if you will. I think when women's organizations are mapped, as they were in several of these examples, as key actors, then we know that they're important to engage in dialogues. And we've also seen concrete examples of women's organizations stepping up with funding, with staff support. They were called and they came was one phrase that I think I heard perhaps from Tatiana. We asked for help and they came. There are resources that women's organizations can bring to the table that are not yet being exploited. Women's networks are not sufficient, of course, but they can be this catalyst. And I think that's when the information and the experience and the awareness that women's organizations can bring, we can talk more seriously about these institutional networks that we need to build. Well, obviously, a lot of attention was shared, brought to our attention around this notion of tools and the sharing of tools. I think that's, again, extremely important. There are very specific sets of knowledge or templates that were shared today around, for example, in Guatemala, the assessing, asking people before they were moved to temporary shelters, are you afraid? Can you work in this area? This is an extreme, just one small example of a very important template that can be shared. So knowledge sharing can also take the form of sharing those particular tools around particular issues. Obviously, I think one of the things, as a teacher, that we're most struck by is both the gap in our ability to teach the new generation this knowledge and the progress that we have made. And hats off to those of you who brought to this meeting concrete, specific knowledge of new modules, new training methodologies, new courses, new ways of integrating gender into, for example, the police academy, which is, again, an extremely important example. We talked here today, I heard today about the importance of doing cross-training, reaching out and working with public health officials, or working, again, with the security officials. Very important. You are building a new generation here. You're also building a new leadership. I love this phrase that I learned here today about not wanting flower pots. We don't need more flower pots, and I assume that there's a corollary for men, but I don't know quite what it would be, because I'm assuming the flower pots are female here. So. But really, that's awareness and education and training that emerges so strongly from so many of your presentations, really is leading toward women who are making and able and willing to make substantial changes in their communities. Which brings me to the fundamental point, again, that came through so clearly, is that knowledge in this area is a tool for social change. We are not mapping our communities. We're not developing training manuals. We're not consulting with our local populations around violence, around health or housing for the fun of it. We're doing this in order to make some fundamental changes in how we organize our society. So yes, knowledge is power. This, I think, is extremely important. We heard examples of participatory action research. We heard also that when women do these kinds of studies, that we will not look only at sex. We will not look only at gender. We will not look only at gender relations. We look at all of these together, right? We won't look just at men, but also at women. Look at masculinities and different kinds of femininities. Look at culturally specific knowledges around risk and risk management. We will also, I think, if you start listening to women and listening to the examples again, will not discuss natural hazards without looking at the larger climate around security issues, around migration, around environmental degradation, around sustainability, and certainly not divorce disaster risk management from adaptation and mitigation around climate change. So I think that's, again, this awareness, training, and education piece. If governments are listening to what was said today here, they will see that they will gain by working with women in the community a much larger, broader perspective. The last point I wanted to make that, again, was very clear, that follows from that, I think, is that what you offer here, again, if there were flies on the wall, they would have heard this so clearly, a position of human rights and social transformation. This is not, again, neutral. Education is never neutral. Awareness and training, so as we move forward in the region and around the world, we'll want to ask, education for whom? Knowledge is for whom? What kind of data? Who's collecting it? For what purpose? For what end, right? But this is transformative knowledge that we're talking about. And you couldn't have been here today and missed that message, that's why we do that kind of research. So I'll stop. There were some examples of good practice in the region that I was hoping would come up and didn't. I'll just put one on the floor, and that is everybody here from PAHO? From in terms of information management systems, because that's one of the most important things in this, in número 3, and that is the Centro Regional de Información de Desastres. That one, de Información de Desastres. And they have a whole gender page, right? So it's one of the main go-to places. It exists only in Central America. I tell all my students about it, right? You go to their website and you can get a really good repository of published gender and disaster-specific resources, many in Spanish and in English. So I think that's an excellent example, and your region has led the way. Another day we'll talk about gaps and barriers and why we're not able to develop these streams of awareness, training, and education to their full extent. But again, hats off to all of you, and thank you for sharing so much.
Yes, I do think that presentation required acknowledgement. Let me add my voice, if I may, to congratulate all the presenters today. It really was a rich day of information and sharing, and all the time we're learning, and it was for me also an exciting learning moment. I'm looking at priority action 4, reduce the underlying risk factors. But I remembered Mauricio when he began the discussion this morning. He reminded us that somehow 2 was missing because we didn't seem to have a particular experience that addressed number 2, know the risks and take action. So I kept my ears open during the day's proceedings to see if in fact any of the presentations that were made could not have just as easily fit under 2. And in fact, maybe it's a sort of a blessing in disguise, but you can't reduce risk unless you understood the risks and you took some action. So the 2 things were sort of hand in hand. The presenters in the section 4 could actually have fallen into 2 as well. One of the things I think that came out very clearly in the presentations that were made in 4, and I want to highlight it, is the issue of information. For instance, in the first presentation that dealt with the Costa Rican earthquake, I remember our young presenter talking about capturing the information around the differential understanding or appreciation of loss. Remember that discussion? Very, very significant, subtle, but very important. And that notion of capturing the differential appreciation or understanding of various components of this disaster risk management is very, very important. It's important for both addressing priority action 2 and 4, and really important across the board because we're saying that our task is to gender mainstream. So I want to highlight for us that kind of information. In the presentation on Guatemala that looked at the relocation of communities, again, the notion of understanding what was happening between the men and the women in the communities was very important, and that came out. Just as well, the presentation on the Eastern Caribbean, where our colleague was looking at the farmers, and she had to select those female farmers and find out what it is that was causing them to be disadvantaged and what could be done to advantage them. The point I'm making here is that maybe we ought to underline the gender-based analysis that we sometimes take for granted. To me, those are skills that we need to sharpen. It's a tool that we need to sharpen, gender-based analysis, so that in fact we can bring the information in a very tangible way, in a very specific and concrete way to the policymakers and to our own women at the community level who need to understand and be empowered to take the kind of actions they want to take. So maybe the task for those of us who are sitting in this room and for technocrats who are assisting others in the development of their programs is to strengthen gender-based analysis, if I can say that. The second task is to strengthen our ability to use information. Our colleague from, and I give the example because I'm familiar with it, our colleague from St. Lucia mentioned the point that they started with the poverty assessments and they started with the assessments of the disasters. Now, this notion of assessing the disasters is called for in Know the Risks and Take Action. In that priority action, it suggests that tools need to be developed, and where they're already developed, disseminated, for statistical information about disasters, the events, the risks, and so on. And we have to know how to use that data that's produced. Maybe I'm a little biased in that regard because I've spent the last 20 years undertaking assessments of disasters. So I'm accustomed to managing that wealth of data and information that is made available to us. And I would love to see better use of it made by women who are then managing how women are going to manage their lives and transform their situations and reduce their risk and make a better life. You know, we often hear the phrase build back better, but we don't apply it to the social dimensions. We apply it, we think of it only in the concrete dimensions, that you build back a house better, but you really build back lives better. And we have to try to insert that notion in the whole management of risk. If we could insert the notion of the importance of the social dimension and therefore building back lives better, whether it's livelihoods, whether it's the relationships between men and women, in the immediacy after a disaster or in the long run, then I think we would have reduced risk and we would have taken action. Thank you very much. And I think you all are wonderful people.
Well, I'd like to also reiterate the previous speakers and thanking you all for being here. We certainly have been planning and thinking about this event for a very long time. I also feel quite honored to be up here with a panel of experts, which I don't really consider myself a gender expert, but anyway, it's been an honor to listen to my colleagues up here and all of you over the course of these last couple of days and in the previous weeks leading up to this. As the previous speaker said, that all of the priorities really are connected. It's very difficult to unravel one piece or one priority from another. And so I'm just going to start out first with a few observations about some of all of the presentations that I think also relate to priority 5, which is to strengthen disaster preparedness. The experience from Honduras really emphasized the importance of interinstitutionality of our work. You know, the work in disaster risk reduction cannot be simply the domain of a national risk management system, although that system generally incorporates all of the other important actors, but there are specific roles for whether that's the National Offices of Women or the Defensorías del Pueblo, the Ombudsman's offices. So I think it's really important to build that and to institutionalize that interinstitutionality. And thinking of that example from Honduras, of course, that played out very importantly when they had the example or the experience of a prison fire earlier this year. And the comment from the speaker there was that what COPECO was able to do is to immediately pick up the phone and call INAMU and get people who were experienced in dealing with the situation of the women who were immediately, lost family members and all in that fire and attendant concerns. So I think here's one example of how working on risk reduction prepares you for that actual event. Some of the other points that came up let's say in the presentation, it was on Haiti, it was also from Chile, where the importance of accessing networks of women, whether those are church-based organizations, faith-based, they're civil society, they're community-based, that often they haven't been accessed enough, either when you're doing your planning, you're doing your municipal or your local, emergency plan or others. Just really important to reach into those networks. And maybe relating this back to, the series of regional meetings we had a year and a half ago, also other vulnerable populations, whether those are the groups of, whether they're attending elderly people, whether those are attending people with HIV/AIDS, or they're handicapped of some. So it's really important to make sure you're building those people and those organizations into your planning. So I think there were a number of examples of that were really important. I think also the experience from Haiti showed us, and this relates to the education, the priority 3, was how important that education really is for being prepared to be able to act. And so that involves training, but it also involves access to education and the inclusion of risk reduction with a gender focus within educational systems. The example from I wanted to mention from UE, from the Mona campus, the use of the educational system to advance disaster risk reduction on all fronts, and incorporating gender equity and analysis. I mean, how important is that for a group of professionals and other students coming out of the university system and occupying important posts, or just as community members? And that's something we're seeing a growth in those courses. It just has an important impact on how people are able to respond and to be prepared. Also, the example from Costa Rica also built in the interinstitutionalization, the Women's Institute, the National Emergency Committee, other sectors. So again, this seems to be one other way to ensure some sustainability in the actions that goes far beyond perhaps the life of a project, but we know how important networking is. So it's been really encouraging to see that work. To sort of cut to the chase here and focus on the two examples that were relating to priority 5. In looking at the experience from Chile, from Caritas, I thought it was really interesting, the focus, the experience on the organization of the community. The speaker spoke of that up until this particular experience, a lot of that organization work was women to be able to help their families. This project took that organization and channeled it out to the community. So women were involved in distribution of supplies. They were involved in a number of different activities. And I think, wouldn't it be, and maybe I didn't capture everything about this experience, like if we can take that sort of experience and apply it to the preparedness phase, and getting the same groups then involved in some of the, being able to keep some of that experience alive. I think the other interesting part was building new social organizations and strengthening existing organizations. Again, some of that had to do more with a particular response, but what if then we, build in that preparedness activity to those experiences that already have been experienced. And then I'm just looking at the experience for Colombia, and I'm going to maybe just talk a little bit more about this, because this one I feel like I know fairly well. I think here we have, and certainly one of the things we wanted to get at in this meeting was like, what are the experiences that can be replicated, but what are some of the tools that have been developed really for capturing, you know, a gender-focused, gender equity in our work. And about 2.5 years ago, when we were preparing for a series of sub-regional meetings, remember we had a meeting in the offices of the National Disaster Risk Management Unit. It was called the Direction at that time. And we took what is a tool, which is called the PLEC. It's the Local Emergency and Contingency Plan, and which hadn't really had a focus of gender or anything else. And we applied a gender focus to each one of those elements, those chapters. And this was really important because this is a tool with long-standing application in Colombia. It certainly has been used, it has been replicated or adapted to other countries. But it was really the first time that that it had really been, you know, you take an existing tool and you bring that incorporation of gender equity, gender focus into it. And of course, that was mentioned in Deanna's presentation at the end, and of course it was taken and applied even further, developed by the Ministry of Health with IOM, and as one of the bases of working with the local and regional disaster committees, the CREPADs and the CLOPADs. And so I think that's another really important element that through the use of this tool, something that had been designed perhaps at a national level was then applied further down. That tool and other tools that were developed under that project then became the base for a very important project that were, well, it covered all kinds of different elements, whether it was the mapping of the risk, strengthening the local capacity of the CLOPADs and CREPADs to work on mental health issues and reproductive health issues. And I think also hearing people talk about this in earlier meetings was fundamental in taking an action that was very much focused on the intention, on the response side to prevention and preparedness. And I think that really does tie it up all together really well. The other thing, and some of my other colleagues said this, was that the importance of bringing in new leadership into, and I think this was in particular relationship to the management of shelters, and making sure that, you know, you're not doing things the same way over and over, but you really are building on your experience, and the importance in those shelters of dealing with gender needs, gender-based needs, but also some of the other needs of vulnerable populations. I think another thing was that it was sort of the catalyst for working with municipalities to incorporate specific funds for response and attention. And I think, you know, this is something that, you know, some governments have done at the national level, but certainly it's important in a climate of decentralization that we are encouraging municipalities to also plan for, you know, these eventualities. If I talked any more about this, I would probably just repeat Deanna's presentation. Maybe one other thing to say, there were, you know, community agreements for especially, you know, regarding the management of shelters. There were also workshops with men to talk about masculinity. So I think this is an interesting experience that, you know, to a certain extent was triggered by the involvement of, you know, some of the Colombian organizations, both government and international and an NGO in this particular process. Certainly it's one that may be of use and help, assistance for other people looking at how they're tying, incorporating gender in a number of different levels, but also tying it across a number of different sectors. So again, it has been a great day. This is what we wanted. I think there's still, certainly lots of room for us to learn and to experience, and certainly we're going to be looking at how we continue to support that. But again, thank you for sharing your experiences with us.
Mauricio, can I add one thing? Yes?
For sure.
I'm sorry, but I'm so old school that I neglected to make one of my major points, which was the beautiful, so many examples of using new social media around information and awareness. So hats off, and I wanted to also say thank you and welcome to our virtual colleagues who are with us here today. I'll be able to go to Chile, I think, to your website and see women blogging as they monitor the reconstruction plan. I'm all about that. I just need to know how to do it. So thank you for bringing that point up. I'm sorry I forgot it before.
Bueno, con esta actividad terminamos la sesión del día de hoy, no sin antes agradecer a nuestros 4 especialistas por sus comentarios. Lo único que les quiero pedir es que antes de irse, por favor, nos dejen las fichas con las preguntas que formularon para poder subirlas a la página y darles respuesta a todas. Muchas gracias a todos. Y a todas, y a todas. Yo sigo aprendiendo también aquí.
Mauricio.